By the third week of March 1881, the ice on the Missouri and its tributaries had turned from solid white to a gray, fractured crust. Upstream, snow from one of the coldest, snowiest winters on record in the plains was finally letting go. When the jams broke, low-lying settlements between Yankton and Vermilion stood in 6 to 15 feet of moving water. River stages along the Missouri rose over 20 feet in places. On the James River bottomlands, many cabins sat on low sills, their plank floors only a foot or so above the hard-packed clay. A few inches of brown water across a 14 by 20 floor meant roughly 500 gallons inside, enough to soak boards, swell joints, and start decay that preservation specialists today warn can follow any prolonged wetting. Most families did what they could, move belongings, wait for the crest, then start bailing. This episode examines a different response, a log house threshold that could be lifted like a mill-stop log. When the river poured in, the sill came out, the doorway became a scupper, and the water left almost as quickly as it arrived. 15th June, 1879. James, Missouri Confluence Country, Dakota Territory. Morning haze hung over sedge and hay meadows where claim markers stood in soil, soft enough to take a boot heel 3 inches deep. Bottomland homesteads promised everything a settler needed. Deep alluvial soil that would grow wheat without back-breaking rock clearing. Hay meadows that could be cut twice in a season. Water access for stock without hauling barrels up from distant springs. Flat ground that made plowing straightforward and timber hauling easier. The James River meandered through a wide valley floor, depositing centuries of fine sediment during its annual spring rises. Land office records from the late 1870s show claims taken rapidly along both banks, with homesteaders filing on parcels within a quarter mile of the main channel. The soil was everything promised: dark, rich, and productive. What those early plat maps did not show was elevation above the ordinary high water mark. Most claims sat on low benches or slight rises that put cabin sites perhaps 2 to 4 feet above the summer river level. For livestock watering and hay transport, this proximity was ideal. Wells could be dug shallow, 15 to 20 feet often reached good water. Paths to the river stayed short and manageable even in mud season. Settlers built accordingly. Simple dug wells with hand pumps. Direct routes from barn to watering point. Cabin sites chosen for view and convenience rather than elevation. Foundation work followed standard practice for log construction on the plains. Stone piers or short posts set into the ground, supporting sill logs that in turn carried the floor joists and wall logs. Preservation surveys of surviving frontier cabins document typical floor elevations. Sill logs sat 12 to 18 inches above grade. Floor surfaces, once planking was laid over joists, stood perhaps 14 to 24 inches above the surrounding ground. This height kept floors above seasonal dampness and provided modest protection against ordinary spring runoff. The problem became apparent only in historical hindsight. Summaries of the Great Flood of 1881 note that low-lying areas between Yankton and Vermilion routinely carried 6 to 15 feet of water during that event. River stage data compiled decades later show the Missouri rising over 20 feet above low water marks in some reaches. Vermilion's original riverside townsite was effectively destroyed and later rebuilt on the bluffs nearly a mile inland. For cabins with floors 18 inches above grade, a 6-foot flood meant water 5.5 feet deep inside. The same features that made a claim attractive on paper, flat ground, fertile soil, near the river, guaranteed that in a high mark year, the first floor sat inside the future channel, not above it. The choice was made without full information. Settlers arriving in the late 1870s saw a river that, in their experience, rose predictably and receded on schedule. The previous decade had been unusually mild across the northern plains. Spring floods were manageable, rarely overtopping the low banks for more than a day or two. Cabins near the water stayed dry enough. But river valleys remember longer than human memory. The James and Missouri had flooded catastrophically before, and hydrologic patterns suggested they would again. Choosing a site for immediate access rather than elevation was rational under the conditions settlers observed. It simply failed to account for events outside their brief window of experience. The cause and effect chain was straightforward. Prioritize water access, hay proximity, and easy hauling. Accept siting within a quarter-mile of the main channel at elevations only slightly above ordinary summer levels. Build standard log cabins with floors barely 2 feet off the ground. When a flood of 1881's magnitude arrived, those cabins would be inside the floodway, not adjacent to it. The same valley that made homesteading possible created the conditions for severe damage when snowpack, ice jams, and rapid melt combined in the right or wrong sequence. Settlers did not yet know that the bottomland they called good dirt sat in a hydraulic zone where extreme floods would measure not in inches, but in multiple feet above their door sills. 20th August, 1880. A Plains homestead site, Lower James River Valley. Freshly hewn sill logs lay on stone pads, joists spanning between them with adze marks still visible in the pale wood. Many modern viewers picture frontier cabins with dirt floors, packed earth smoothed by use. In practice, a great number of homesteaders aimed for plank floors from the outset when lumber, time, and skill allowed. National Park Service preservation briefs and field guides to log construction describe the common pattern: horizontally laid log walls, saddle-notched or V-notched at corners, resting on earth-fast posts or low stone foundations. Floor framing followed straightforward carpentry. Sill logs, typically 8 to 12 inches in diameter, ran parallel along opposite walls. These sills supported joists, hewn or sawn timbers roughly 3 inches by 6 inches or 3 by 8 inches, spaced 16 to 24 inches apart. When sawn lumber was available from a nearby mill, joists might be dimensional lumber. When not, settlers hewed joists from straight-grained logs using a broadaxe or adze, creating flat top and bottom surfaces. Across these joists, builders nailed plank flooring. Board thickness varied with what could be obtained. 7/8 of an inch to 1 1/4 inches was typical. Planks were laid tight, often with tongue and groove edges if milled lumber was used, or simply butted if hand-riven. The goal was a floor that reduced drafts, kept out vermin, and provided a clean, dry surface for living. Crawl spaces beneath these floors were minimal, with sills only 12 to 18 inches above grade and joists adding another few inches. The gap between ground and floor surface rarely exceeded 24 inches. Little attention was paid to ventilation in this space. Earth was often packed or left bare directly under the floor. In winter, this limited air movement helped reduce cold drafts. In wet conditions, it trapped moisture. Doorways required special framing. After the log shell was raised, openings for doors and windows were cut. Vertical jamb posts were set into notches in the wall logs to reinforce the opening and carry loads around the gap. Between these jamb posts, at floor level, a threshold timber was fitted. This piece, often 3 to 4 inches thick and 6 to 8 inches deep, spanned the doorway, providing a solid base against which the door bottom could seal. Thresholds were sometimes mortised into the jamb posts or simply spiked or pegged between them. Many were set slightly proud of the floor surface, raised a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch to shed drafts and reduce snow blow-in. The threshold formed a continuous barrier at the base of the door, with the door itself hung on leather or iron strap hinges above it. The entire floor assembly was designed as a continuous, sealed membrane. Tight joints between planks kept cold air from rising through the floor in winter. The threshold closed the base of the door opening, chinking between wall log sealed gaps. The goal was a cabin interior insulated from exterior conditions, wind, cold, and moisture. This design worked well for its intended purpose. Floors stayed warmer than dirt. Drafts were minimized. Vermin entry was reduced. Maintenance was straightforward. Damaged planks could be pried up and replaced, and joists were accessible from below if repairs were needed. But the continuous floor and fixed threshold created an unintended consequence. When water entered the cabin, the interior behaved like a shallow tank. There was no designed outlet at the low point. Water that came in, whether from rain through a leaky roof, spills during washing, or floodwater through the door, had only two ways out: evaporation or manual removal. For a cabin with a 14 by 18-foot floor, every inch of standing water equaled approximately 157 gallons. 2 inches meant 314 gallons. 3 inches, 471 gallons. A family facing even a modest flood accumulation inside their cabin confronted hundreds of gallons that had to be baled by hand, bucket by bucket, or left to evaporate over days or weeks. Preservation literature on historic log buildings emphasizes that even routine floor washing, mopping with excess water, can drive moisture through cracks into the crawl space where poor ventilation allows it to linger. Wood moisture content rises. Decay fungi find favorable conditions. Sills and joists begin to rot from below, often invisibly, until structural failure becomes apparent. With floodwater, this problem scaled dramatically. Instead of cups of water, homesteaders faced gallons. Instead of drying in hours, saturated floors and subfloor spaces could remain damp for weeks. The same tight construction that kept the cabin warm in winter kept floodwater trapped inside after the river receded. Builders spent days fitting tight floors to keep cold air out. That same tightness and the fixed threshold that anchored the door would later keep floodwater in. The cabin was optimized for normal use, not for the abnormal event when the river climbed over the sill and poured across the planks. Mid-19th century background. Mill dams, canal works, irrigation ditches across the Midwest and plains. A mill pond backed up behind a low timber dam, boards stacked in iron-pinned slots along the crest. Many frontier settlers had direct experience with waterworks before filing homestead claims. Some had worked in sawmills, others had labored on canal construction or maintained irrigation ditches. Still others had simply observed mill dams in operation near their former homes. This exposure meant a significant portion of the homesteading population understood, at least in principle, how controlled water systems functioned. Mill dams and canal structures used a common technology for managing variable water levels, removable wooden boards called flashboards or stop logs. These boards or timbers were set into vertical grooves or against iron pins along the crest of a dam or weir. By stacking boards, operators could raise the water level behind the structure, increasing the pond depth and head available to turn a mill wheel. By removing boards, they could lower the level, reduce flow, or safely pass high water during spring freshets. The principle was simple and ancient. Instead of building a fixed crest that could be overtopped or destroyed during floods, builders created an adjustable barrier. In normal conditions, all boards remained in place, holding back water. When high water threatened, operators removed some or all of the boards, allowing water to pass through the lowered crest without endangering the main structure. The boards were sacrificial and easily replaced. The permanent masonry or timber framework remained protected. Stop logs were sized for manual handling. A single worker could lift and remove one board, typically 4 to 6 inches tall and 3 to 4 feet long, made from dense hardwood or treated pine. Boards stacked to create the total crest height, each one resting on the one below or on pins set at intervals up the side supports. In an emergency, even a single removed board would drop the crest height enough to start relieving pressure. Technical descriptions from mill and dam histories describe these systems in detail. The boards fit into slots or channels cut into masonry or timber piers on each side of the opening. Iron pins, set horizontally through the side walls, provided additional shear resistance and kept boards aligned. Seals between boards and side walls were often simple, close-fitting carpentry supplemented by oakum, leather strips, or other packing materials pressed into gaps. Trash racks, grates of iron or heavy timber, were installed upstream of mill races to prevent debris from clogging the works. Flumes and chutes were designed with calculated slopes to maintain controlled flow velocity. Spillways were sized to pass expected maximum flows without overtopping adjacent earthworks. Every element of a well-designed waterworks anticipated both normal operation and emergency conditions. Millwrights would never build a dam with no way to shed a flood. The consequences of such a design were obvious. The structure would fail catastrophically, the mill would be destroyed, and downstream areas would suffer damage from the sudden release. Removable boards allowed controlled failure. The dam could give way where and when the miller chose, rather than at its weakest point during the peak of a flood. This logic was well understood among people who worked with water. Yet most frontier cabins were built with no such provision. Thresholds were fixed. Door frames were permanent. If water entered, there was no designed path for it to leave. The cabin either held against the water, unlikely in a major flood, or it filled and remained flooded until the occupants could bail it out by hand. A few settlers made the conceptual leap. If a mill dam could have removable boards to manage rising water, a cabin threshold could, in principle, be treated the same way. The doorway was already the lowest opening in the wall. The threshold already spanned between two vertical supports. With minor modifications to the framing, that threshold could be made removable, creating a low outlet exactly where one was needed. The tools required were already in frontier toolboxes: hand saws to cut mortises, augers to bore holes for pins, chisels to clean joints, hammers and draw knives to fit parts. The hardware, wrought iron or hardwood pins, was the same type used in door hinges, gate latches, and other everyday carpentry. The joinery techniques were familiar to anyone who had framed a door or built a gate. What was required was not new technology, but a shift in thinking. Treat the cabin threshold not as a permanent barrier, but as an adjustable control element. Except that in a severe flood, water would enter. Design for that reality by providing a way for it to leave quickly, under control, through the largest opening in the structure. A standard door sill and a low stop log were essentially the same object. One was installed with the assumption that water would never reach it, or that if it did, the cabin would simply withstand the event. The other was installed with the assumption that water might come, and that when it did, the structure should be able to adapt. The physical difference was minimal, a matter of how the timber was attached. The conceptual difference was profound. Eastern Dakota Territory, October 1880 to March 1881. Snowdrifts swallowing fence posts, rail lines buried behind walls of wind-packed snow, locomotives stalled in cuts that filled faster than crews could shovel. Settlers expected hard winters on the northern plains. Cold was routine, snow was normal, but the winter of 1880 to 1881 was exceptional. Analysis of meteorological records and later reconstructions based on newspaper accounts, military weather observations, and personal diaries shows prolonged cold, repeated blizzards, and snow accumulations that ranked near record levels across the region. The season began unusually early. On 15 October 1880, a blizzard struck with little warning, dropping temperatures to 20 below zero and piling snow and drifts that buried livestock caught in open country. That storm marked the beginning of what would later be called the hard winter or the long winter. For the next 6 months, bitter cold and repeated storms closed roads, stopped rail traffic, and isolated settlements across Dakota Territory. Railroads, the lifeline of frontier towns, became impassable. Trains scheduled to run between Yankton and Points West simply stopped. Drifts higher than locomotive smokestacks blocked the tracks. Work crews sent to clear the line made progress measured in yards per day, only to have their work undone by the next blizzard. By late December, entire stretches of track were abandoned until spring. Towns that depended on rail-delivered supplies faced shortages of flour, coffee, coal, and other essentials. Snow depth measurements, where recorded, were extraordinary. Reports from military posts and settlements described snow lying level at 3 to 4 feet across open prairie with drifts piled, 10 to 20 feet high in protected areas and cuts. Unlike typical plain snow that compacted or melted during brief warm spells, the snow from 1880 to 1881 stayed on the ground. Temperatures remained below freezing for weeks at a time. Each new storm added to the existing pack. From a hydrologic perspective, the winter was loading the region's rivers with water that would eventually have to go somewhere. Every inch of snow on the ground represented roughly 1/10 of an inch of water equivalent, varying with snow density. Across the vast drainage basins of the Missouri, James, Vermilion, and Big Sioux rivers, the accumulated snowpack by late February represented an enormous volume of potential runoff. Historical weather analysis explicitly connects the severity of the 1880 to 1881 winter to the Great Flood of 1881. When spring finally arrived in late March, temperatures rose rapidly. The snowpack melted quickly. Ice jams on the rivers, formed during the cold months, broke and moved downstream, creating temporary dams that backed water up behind them. When these jams released, walls of water and ice surged through the valleys. For anyone watching the rivers in late winter, the signs were clear. The snow depth was unprecedented. The cold had been relentless. The river ice was thick and solid, extending bank to bank. When all that stored water and ice began to move, the spring flood would be severe. Some settlers prepared as best they could. Livestock were moved to higher ground. Household goods were shifted to lofts or upper floors. Boats were readied, but preparation options were limited. Cabins could not be moved, foundations could not be raised overnight. For homesteaders already situated on low ground, the winter had locked in the conditions that would determine whether their cabins survived the spring flood. Hydrologic analyses compiled in later decades rank the 1881 flood among the highest on record for the James and Missouri rivers. Stage rises of 20 to 25 feet above low water were documented at multiple locations. Bottomlands that normally flooded to depths of a foot or two were inundated by 6 to 15 feet of moving water. Towns built on low terraces like Green Island and parts of Vermilion were effectively destroyed. The winter of 1880 to 1881 transformed the abstract possibility of a catastrophic flood into an imminent certainty. By late February, anyone who understood snowpack and river behavior knew that the spring breakup would be dangerous. The lift-out sill and similar flood preparation measures were rational responses to a predictable threat. The exact timing and magnitude might be uncertain, but the general outcome, a major flood, was not. Once the river was measured by depth of snow in its watershed rather than by summer stage marks on a tree, the once-in-20 years flood was no longer a easy rumor. It was a design requirement, and cabins built without regard for that requirement would face the consequences when the ice finally let go. James River, near its confluence with the Missouri, autumn 1880. A log shell stood on short stone piers above hay meadow stubble, a narrow path leading from the door toward a shallow cut down to the river. To understand what a lift-out sill could accomplish, it is necessary to reconstruct a baseline. A typical bottomland log house as it would have been built in the lower James Valley in 1880. Preservation surveys and historic log building guides provide the template. The cabin was modest but functional, representing the standard pattern settlers followed when building in that time and place. Dimensions: 14 feet by 20 feet, a single room with no interior partitions. This size met Homestead Act requirements for a habitable dwelling and provided enough space for a family of 4 to 6. Larger cabins existed, but 14 by 20 was common for initial construction, with additions planned for later years. Wall construction: horizontally laid logs, typically cottonwood, elm, or pine, harvested from creek bottoms and nearby timbered areas. Logs were 8 to 12 inches in diameter, hewn flat on top and bottom surfaces to create tighter joints. Corners used saddle notches or V-notches, straightforward joinery that required only an axe and some experience. Chinking between logs was a mixture of clay, grass, and occasionally lime, packed into the gaps and smoothed on both interior and exterior faces. Foundation: stone piers at each corner and at midpoints along longer walls. Piers were stacked fieldstone, dry laid or mortared with clay, rising about 12 inches above grade. Sill logs rested directly on these piers. This minimal foundation provided support while keeping the lowest logs off direct ground contact, reducing rot. Floor framing: sill logs ran parallel along the 14-foot dimension. Across these, joists spanned at intervals of 16 to 24 inches. Joists were either hewn from logs or, if a sawmill was accessible, dimensional lumber roughly 3 by 8 inches. Plank flooring, typically 1 inch thick, was nailed across the joists. The finished floor surface sat approximately 18 inches above the surrounding grade, 12 inches from stone piers plus 6 inches of sill and joist depth. Roof: a simple gable, log purlins supporting split shakes or sawn boards, often covered with a layer of sod for insulation and waterproofing. Ridge height was about 12 feet, giving headroom inside and a steep enough pitch to shed rain and snow. Door and window. The main door was centered on the long wall facing the river, roughly 3 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall. A single small window, perhaps 2 feet square, was positioned on the opposite wall for cross-ventilation and light. The door was built from vertical planks, held together with horizontal battens and hung on strap hinges. The threshold was a squared timber spanning between jamb posts, fitted tightly to reduce drafts. Interior, a stone or clay fireplace at one end, a sleeping platform or bed frame along one wall, shelves and pegs for storage. Simple furniture, a table, benches, perhaps a cabinet, completed the space. The floor was swept bare or occasionally covered with rag rugs. This cabin was well built by frontier standards. The logs were fitted carefully. The chinking was thorough. The floor was solid. In normal years, it would be warm in winter, reasonably dry, and livable for a family establishing their claim. The site, close to water and hay ground, was chosen for practical reasons. The low foundation height was standard practice. But measured against the flood of 1881, the cabin's position and construction created unavoidable vulnerability. The floor surface, 18 inches above grade, sat far below the 6 to 15 feet of water documented in the bottoms during that event. Water would not simply lap at the doorstep, it would cover the entire floor to a depth of several feet. With the door barred and the threshold fixed, water entering through chinks in the walls and gaps around the door would accumulate inside with no outlet. The cabin would flood not because it was poorly built, but because it was sited in a location where extreme floods reached depths that overtopped any reasonable foundation height for a log cabin. Family accounts from the region describe homesteads along the James inundated in 1881. One account mentions a great-grandfather's claim near the confluence, where water reached the windowsills and the family evacuated to higher ground. These narratives confirm that bottomland cabins, no matter how well constructed, faced overwhelming water volumes during the peak of the flood. The mathematics were simple. A 14 by 20 floor equaled 280 square feet. 1 inch of water over that area was approximately 175 gallons. 6 inches, a plausible depth if the exterior flood reached 2 or 3 feet above the threshold, meant roughly 1,050 gallons inside the cabin. Manual bailing with 10-quart buckets at 2.5 gallons per bucket would require over 400 trips to remove that volume. Even working continuously, a single person might need 8 to 10 hours. If water continued to seep in, the task became Sisyphean. This was the baseline against which any modification had to be judged. The cabin was typical. The siting was typical. The flood risk, in hindsight, was typical for that valley. What came next was not typical, a threshold designed to be removed, turning the door opening into a drain that could empty the cabin in a fraction of the time bailing required. General timber structure behavior, with 1881 as example. Close view of a plank floor, dark tide lines and cupped boards where water once stood. Many people think of flood damage in visible terms: mud, silt, displaced furniture, and ruined belongings. But conservation literature on historic wooden structures emphasizes that the primary long-term threat from flooding is invisible: elevated wood moisture content and the decay it enables. Wood is hygroscopic. It absorbs and releases moisture in response to the humidity of its surroundings. In normal indoor conditions on the plains, wood moisture content might stabilize around 8 to 12% by weight. At these levels, wood remains dimensionally stable and resistant to biological decay. Decay fungi, the organisms responsible for wood rot, require moisture, oxygen, and moderate temperatures to colonize and break down wood fibers. Laboratory studies and field observations establish that decay fungi become active when wood moisture content rises above approximately 27% and remains there for extended periods. Below that threshold, wood may be damp, but it will not support fungal growth. Above it, decay progresses steadily. When floodwater enters a cabin, every wetted surface, floor planks, joists, sill logs, wall logs below the waterline, immediately absorbs water. Within hours, moisture content in those timbers can exceed 50%. If the water recedes or is removed quickly, and if air circulation is adequate, the wood begins to dry. Moisture content drops back below the critical threshold before fungi can establish. The wood may show staining or minor surface degradation, but structural integrity remains. If water remains standing for days, or if the crawl space stays damp even after water is removed, drying is delayed. Timbers remain above 27% moisture for weeks. Fungi colonize. Decay begins, typically at the most vulnerable points. The interface between floor planks and joists, the underside of joists where they rest on sills, and the sills themselves where they contact stone piers or damp earth. Preservation briefs on log building conservation warn specifically about this pattern. Leaks, standing water, and poor drainage around kitchens, lower logs, and floor systems are among the most common causes of severe rot in historic cabins. Once decay begins, it progresses inward from the wetted surface, compromising structural strength long before visible signs appear. For a cabin with a 14 by 20 floor, the water volume matters directly. At 2 inches of standing water, the cabin holds roughly 350 gallons. At 4 inches, 700 gallons. At 6 inches, 1,050 gallons. Each of these volumes represents liquid sitting in contact with the underside of floor planks, soaking into the wood, pooling in the crawl space, and keeping humidity high in the enclosed air below the floor. Drying time depends on conditions. If the cabin can be opened, door and window unblocked, air moving through, and if exterior humidity is low, a wet floor might dry noticeably in 48 to 72 hours. But if standing water remains in the crawl space, or if the weather is damp, drying can take a week or more. During that time, the wood stays above the critical moisture threshold. Historical accounts from the 1881 flood along the Missouri describe families returning after the water receded to find cellars and first floors soaked, furniture ruined, and walls stained to the height of the waterline. Some cabins were judged beyond repair and abandoned. Others were gutted and rebuilt from the floor joists up. The determining factor was often how long the water had stood inside. A cabin that flooded but drained within hours faced manageable repairs. Planks could be dried, mud shoveled out, damaged goods discarded. Structural timbers remained sound. A cabin that stayed flooded for days or weeks faced rot that might not become apparent for months or years, but which would eventually require floor replacement, joist repair, or even sill log renewal. The engineering calculation then was not whether a lift-out sill would prevent flooding. In a flood of 1881's magnitude, preventing inflow was impossible. The calculation was whether reducing standing water time from days to hours would preserve the cabin's structural integrity. The difference between a floor that dried in a day and one that stayed damp for a week could determine whether the cabin was still habitable the following winter, or whether it sat abandoned, a slowly rotting shell, on the bottomland. Missouri-James Confluence Region, March 1881. Distant crack and roar as an ice jam broke. Minutes later, chunks of ice grinding through willows along the bank. Early spring thaws in 1881 produced ice jams along the Missouri from Fort Buford in the north down into southeastern Dakota. River ice, which had frozen to thicknesses of 2 to 3 feet during the relentless cold, began to break up as temperatures finally rose above freezing in mid-March. But the breakup was not gradual. Solid sheets fractured into massive pans that piled against bends and bridge piers, creating temporary dams. Behind these ice jams, water backed up rapidly. Observers described scenes of chaos, gorges of ice 40 miles long filling the river channel, water spreading laterally across the floodplain as the main channel became blocked, and sudden releases when jams finally gave way, sending walls of water and ice downstream to create new jams or inundate everything in their path. Stage data compiled in later hydrologic studies document the scale of the 1881 flood. Between Yankton and Vermilion, river stages rose between 20 and 25 feet above low water marks. Bottomlands along the James, which normally flooded to depths of 1 or 2 feet during routine spring high water, were inundated by 6 to 15 feet. Railroads reported tracks submerged along stretches between the Big Sioux and James confluences. Towns built on low benches, Green Island, parts of Niobrara, were described in contemporary press accounts as standing in water up to second-story windows or being swept away entirely. The timing was rapid. Flood timelines from local accounts show water rising from ordinary spring levels to major flood stage in a matter of hours once ice jams broke upstream. A settler checking stock near the river in the morning might return in the afternoon to find water halfway to the cabin. By evening, the cabin floor could be underwater. For a cabin with its floor 18 inches above grade, a 6-foot flood meant water roughly 4.5 feet deep inside if the door was breached, or if the flood rose over the threshold. Even a more modest 4-foot flood put 2.5 feet of water across the interior. These were not depths that could be waded through while carrying furniture. They were depths that floated light goods, soaked everything below waist height, and made the cabin uninhabitable until the water receded. Contemporary accounts describe families evacuating to higher ground or to neighbors on better situated claims. Livestock were driven to bluffs. Wagons and movable goods were hauled away if time allowed. But cabins could not be moved. Once the water arrived, the structure either withstood the event or it did not. The flood crest typically lasted hours to a day or more, depending on location and the behavior of upstream ice jams. As jams released and reformed, stage levels fluctuated. Water might rise, recede slightly, then rise again. For cabins in the floodway, this meant repeated inundation, with little opportunity to begin cleanup between surges. When the flood finally peaked and began to recede, the rate of decline was often as rapid as the rise had been. Water levels could drop several feet in a single day. For cabins that had flooded, this should have been the moment when cleanup could begin. But cabins with fixed thresholds and sealed floors retained water. As the exterior flood level dropped, the interior remained full, the water trapped by the same tight construction that had been designed to keep it out. A cabin on low ground during the 1881 flood faced two distinct hydraulic events. The first was the inundation, water entering through every available gap, rising to match the exterior level. The second was the retention. After the external flood receded, interior water remained until manually removed. The difference between these two events, flooding and draining, determined how quickly a family could return and how much damage the structure sustained. Historical photographs and accounts from the period show riverfront towns with water stains reaching halfway up first-floor walls, streets still ankle-deep in mud days after the peak, and families bailing out homes bucket by bucket. The sheer volume of water that had to be removed by hand exceeded the capacity of most households. Cleanup took days or weeks. Some families gave up and relocated. For anyone who had anticipated the flood and designed their cabin with drainage in mind, the calculation was different. The flood would still come, the cabin would still fill. But if the threshold could be removed, the interior would drain as fast as the exterior level fell. A flood that peaked and receded in a day might leave the cabin wet, but drainable in hours. The same flood in a standard cabin might leave water standing for a week. James River Bottom, reconstructed shopwork, autumn 1880. A carpenter's brace bit into a door jamb, boring a clean, round hole. An iron pin lay ready on the work table. Period log building practice did not routinely call for removable thresholds, but the tools and joinery techniques were already in use for other purposes. This section reconstructs, step by step, how a lift-out sill could have been built using 1880s tools and hardware based on documented carpentry methods and mill stop-log design. The doorway, 3 feet clear width, the standard for a frontier cabin. Vertical jamb posts framed the opening, cut from squared timbers roughly 4 inches by 6 inches, set into notches in the wall logs and extending from floor to lintel. These posts carried the structural loads around the door and provided attachment points for hinges and latching hardware. The sill timber, dense hardwood preferred, oak or ash if available, tight-grained pine if not. The timber was roughly 3 inches thick, 8 inches deep, and cut to span the full width between jamb posts, approximately 36 to 38 inches. This size was manageable for 1 or 2 people to lift, yet substantial enough to resist water pressure and provide a solid seal. Joinery. The key modification was treating the sill as a removable piece rather than a fixed member. At each end, shallow housings were cut into the jamb posts at floor level, rectangular pockets about half an inch deep, sized to receive the ends of the sill and located precisely. These housings kept the sill from shifting sideways under door traffic or water pressure. Pins, horizontal iron or hardwood pins, half-inch to 3/4 inch diameter, were installed through each jamb post at a height just above the sill top when the sill was seated in its housings. Holes for the pins were bored using a brace and auger bit, the same tools used for every other boring operation in frontier carpentry. The pins extended through the jamb and slightly past the interior face, providing a horizontal barrier that kept the sill from lifting under normal door use, but could be withdrawn to allow removal. Alternatively, a vertical pin arrangement could be used, holes bored into the top of the sill at each end with matching holes in the underside of the jamb crosspiece or in a horizontal support just above the sill. Short pins dropped into these aligned holes would hold the sill down. To remove the sill, the pins were pulled vertically and the sill could then be lifted free. Sealing. In place, the sill needed to function as a normal threshold, keeping out drafts, shedding minor water, and providing a solid surface under the door bottom. A small bevel or chamfer cut along the exterior edge directed rain and surface water away from the joint. On the interior side, a strip of wool, felt, oakum, or oiled cloth was tacked into a shallow rabot cut along the sill's inner face. When the door closed, the bottom edge compressed this seal, reducing airflow. Floor integration, the floor planks butted against the interior face of the sill. In a standard cabin, the sill was installed flush with the floor surface or slightly proud. Here, the sill sat in its housings with the top surface exactly level with the surrounding floor, creating a smooth transition. A narrow channel, 1 inch wide, 2 inches deep, was cut into the floor planks immediately inside the door line, running the full width of the opening. This scupper channel sloped slightly downward toward the door, ensuring that any water on the floor would flow toward the threshold when the sill was removed. Installation sequence. The floor planks were laid first, stopping short of the doorway. The jamb posts were set and the housings for the sill were cut. The scupper channel was routed into the last course of floor planks. The sill was fitted, tested for fit, and adjusted. Pins were installed but left loose. The door was hung and checked for clearance. Once everything fit correctly, the pins were driven home or locked in place with small wedges, and the draft seal was added. In normal use, the sill remained in place. It looked and functioned exactly like a standard threshold. Foot traffic passed over it. The door sealed against it. In winter, drafts were blocked. The cabin interior stayed tight and warm. In flood conditions, when water threatened, the process reversed. The door was opened and removed from its hinges if time allowed. The pins holding the sill were withdrawn, knocked or pried out in the case of horizontal pins, pulled up in the case of vertical pins. The sill was lifted out of its housings and set aside. The doorway now opened directly from the interior floor to the exterior ground, with the scupper channel providing a smooth path for water to exit at the lowest point. The entire conversion from standard threshold to drainage scupper required only minutes. 1 or 2 people could accomplish it with basic hand tools, a hammer or pry bar to remove the pins, hands to lift the sill. No sawing, no dismantling of the door frame, no structural modification beyond what had been built in during initial construction. The design was a direct application of mill stop-log principles scaled to the domestic scale. Millwrights made boards removable by setting them on pins in grooves. Cabin builders could make a threshold removable by setting it on pins in housings. The engineering was identical. The only difference was context. One added day of careful joinery, cutting housings, boring holes, fitting pins, turned a permanent barrier into a removable valve. The sill still did everything a normal threshold did, but with the option, when needed, of giving water a fast, controlled exit at exactly the point where it would drain the floor most effectively. James River Bottom Cabin, 23rd to 24th March, 1881. A thin sheet of water creeping across plank seams, leaving a lace of silt where it met the far wall. Flood marks on tree trunks were fresh and bright. A simple staff gauge, a wooden post marked in inches, nailed to a tree at the riverbank, showed the stage climbing steadily through the afternoon of the 23rd. Water that had been 6 feet below the low bank at dawn was now lapping at the edge. By mid-afternoon, it had spread into the meadow. By evening, it reached the path leading to the cabin. In most cabins, the response was uniform. Move belongings to sleeping lofts or upper shelves. Bar the door. Stuff rags into visible gaps in the chinking. Wait. Hope the water stopped before reaching the threshold. If it did not, endure. Water found its way in through dozens of small openings. Chinking between logs, even when well packed, was not waterproof under pressure. Gaps around the window frame admitted seepage. The joint where the threshold met the floor planks, no matter how carefully fitted, allowed slow infiltration. As the exterior water level rose to match and then exceed the cabin floor height, these minor leaks became steady trickles. Inside a cabin with a fixed threshold, the water had nowhere to go. It pooled in low spots, spread across the floor in a thin layer, and gradually deepened as exterior pressure continued to push more water through the gaps. A family watching from the loft could do nothing but wait and measure the rise. For a cabin with a lift-out sill, the sequence was different. As water began seeping in, the threshold was removed. The process took minutes. Open the door, withdraw the pins, lift the sill free, set it aside. The doorway now stood open at floor level, the 3-foot width unobstructed. Water still entered through chinks and gaps, but now it also exited through the door. As long as the exterior flood level remained higher than the interior floor, water flowed in. But once the flood began to recede, the flow reversed. Water drained out through the doorway, following the scupper channel cut into the floor planks. The hydraulic behavior was straightforward. The cabin did not stay dry. That was impossible when surrounded by several feet of floodwater. But the interior water level tracked the exterior level, rather than accumulating independently. When the exterior flood reached its crest, the interior matched. When the exterior started to fall, the interior fell with it. To understand the magnitude of this difference, consider the numbers. A 14 by 20 floor holds roughly 175 gallons per inch of depth. At 3 inches, a modest accumulation if exterior flood depth reached even 2 feet over the threshold. The total volume was 525 gallons. Removing that manually with 2.5-gallon buckets required over 210 trips. A strong adult working continuously might move 20 to 30 buckets per hour for a total of 50 to 75 gallons per hour. At that rate, clearing the cabin would take 7 to 10 hours of sustained labor. A 3-foot wide doorway with even a few inches of head, the depth difference between interior and exterior water, could discharge at far higher rates. Hydraulic calculations for low head openings suggest flow rates of several gallons per second under modest pressure. Even at conservative estimates, passive discharge through the removed threshold could approach or exceed several hundred gallons per hour. The cabin might still take an hour or more to drain fully, but that was an order of magnitude faster than manual bailing. Moreover, the drainage was passive. No one had to stand in cold, filthy water hauling buckets. No one had to organize a relay to pass buckets outside. The water simply left, following the path of least resistance as soon as the exterior level dropped below the interior. The critical difference came in the hours and days after the flood crested. In a standard cabin, families returned to find inches of standing water, even after the river had receded. They faced days of bailing, shoveling out silt, and salvaging waterlogged belongings. The floor and subfloor timbers stayed wet for a week or more, depending on weather and ventilation. In a cabin with a drainage scupper, families might return to find the floor still damp and silt-covered, but not submerged. Water had drained as the river fell. Air could circulate. The drying process had already begun. Within a day or two, the floor could be swept clean. Within a week, moisture content in the timbers dropped back towards safe levels. The same flood, the same reach of river, the same elevation band. 2 different cabins. One with a fixed threshold, holding water like a tank. One with a removable threshold, draining like a mill race. The depth and duration of standing water diverged sharply, even though both structures flooded in the conventional sense. The difference was not in whether water entered, but in how quickly it left. April to May 1881, then decades later in preservation surveys. Boards pulled up years later, Joist tops in one cabin showed deep rot and fungal lines, in another only surface staining. To the eye, in the immediate aftermath of the 1881 flood, both cabins, one with a standard threshold, one with a lift-out sill, appeared flooded. Water had entered, floors were wet, silt covered the planks, families faced cleanup and repair. The difference would only become clear over time, revealed in the wood itself. Wood science establishes that decay fungi require sustained high moisture content and time. Timber that wets and then dries quickly fares far better than timber left in continuously damp conditions. The critical threshold sits around 27 to 30% moisture content by weight. Below this level, wood is inhospitable to the fungi that cause rot. Above it, especially if the moisture persists for weeks or months, decay progresses. When floodwater enters a cabin, every wetted timber immediately absorbs water. Floor planks swell. Joists soak up moisture from below where they rest on sills. Sill logs, already in contact with damp stone piers and earth, become thoroughly saturated. Within hours, moisture content in these members can exceed 50%. If the water drains quickly and air circulation resumes, drying begins immediately. Surface moisture evaporates first. Interior moisture migrates outward, driven by the humidity gradient between the wet wood and the drier surrounding air. Within days, the timber's moisture content can drop back below the critical decay threshold. The wood may show staining, minor surface checks, or warping, but the structural interior remains sound. If water remains standing, or if the crawl space stays damp even after surface water is bailed out, drying is delayed. Joists that sit in a humid, poorly ventilated space under the floor remain above 30% moisture for weeks. During this time, decay fungi colonize the wood. Spores, always present in any outdoor environment, germinate when conditions are favorable. Fungal threads penetrate the wood cells, secreting enzymes that break down cellulose and lignin. The wood begins to soften and lose strength. Subfloor airflow is critical. In a log cabin with minimal crawl space, 12 to 18 inches between ground and floor planks, and no designed ventilation openings, the air beneath the floor is stagnant. Humidity remains high. Evaporation is slow. Even after standing water is removed from the cabin interior, moisture trapped in the soil and timbers below the floor keeps conditions favorable for decay. Preservation briefs on log cabin conservation repeatedly emphasize this pattern. Leaks around kitchens, where wash water spills through cracks, create chronic moisture at specific floor sections. Over years, those sections rot while adjacent areas remain sound. Similarly, floods that saturate lower logs and floors but are not followed by effective drying create decay that may not become visible for months or even years, but which progresses steadily in the hidden spaces between floors and walls. For a cabin that drained in hours, the wood drying curve was steep. Boards still wet, but no longer submerged, began drying within the first day. Joists, though saturated, started releasing moisture as soon as air could circulate under the floor. Assuming reasonable weather, spring temperatures in the 40s to 60s Fahrenheit, with even modest wind, moisture content in the timbers could drop below 30% within a week. Decay fungi might begin to colonize, but the window of opportunity was narrow. Most would not establish before conditions became inhospitable. For a cabin that retained standing water for days, the curve was much slower. Even after the water was finally bailed out, the crawl space remained damp. Ground moisture and the residual water content in soil and timbers kept humidity high. Drying took weeks. Moisture content in the joists and lower floor planks stayed above 30% for extended periods. Decay fungi had ample time to establish, and once established, they continued to operate as long as moisture remained adequate. The difference between fast drainage and prolonged ponding translated directly into timber service life. A floor that drained quickly might need only surface cleaning, minor plank replacement, and routine maintenance after the flood. A floor that stayed wet for days might require full joist replacement, sill log repair, and extensive work to correct rot damage, work that might not be necessary immediately, but which would become unavoidable within a few years as the decay progressed inward. Preservation surveys conducted decades after historic floods often find exactly this pattern. Cabins known to have flooded show varying degrees of decay in lower structural members. Some have floors that, while old and worn, remain structurally sound. Others show severe rot concentrated at joists and sills, requiring major interventions to stabilize. The difference correlates with how the cabin managed water, whether it held it or drained it, and how long the timbers remained wet. The 1881 flood was not the last high water on the James and Missouri. Floods in subsequent years, though generally less severe, tested the same structures again. Cabins that had dried quickly after 1881 were better positioned to survive later events. Their timbers had not been compromised. Cabins that had suffered prolonged wetting and early-stage decay in 1881 faced each subsequent flood with already weakened floors and sills. The cumulative damage accelerated their decline. A difference of a day or two in drying time could translate over decades into the difference between a floor patched and a floor completely replaced. The lift-out sill did not make flooding harmless, but it shifted the outcome from structural crisis to maintenance task. 1880s to early 20th century, floodplains across the plains. A carpenter in a later photograph stood at a doorway set above a stone stoop. The threshold showed signs of being a replaceable piece. The principle of controlled drainage at cabin thresholds spread unevenly across the flood-prone regions of the northern plains in the decades following 1881. Some builders adopted the lift-out sill or similar techniques. Many did not. And some adaptations, while well-intentioned, failed due to poor execution or unsuitable conditions. Informal transfer was the primary mechanism. Neighbors observing a cabin that had survived the flood with minimal damage might ask how it was built. Carpenters working on repairs might notice details, housings and jam posts, pins in unusual locations, scupper channels and floors, and incorporate similar features into their own work or suggest them to clients. No written plans circulated, no patents were filed. Knowledge moved through conversation and example. Regional variations emerged. In some flood-prone bottomlands, settlers began installing raised thresholds as a matter of course, thresholds set 6 to 12 inches higher than the surrounding floor, creating a barrier that held back minor flooding, and if breached, could be removed to allow drainage. Stone or concrete aprons outside doorways provided durable surfaces that resisted scour when water exited at high velocity. Small scupper channels or drain holes were cut into floors near doorways, sometimes with removable wooden plugs that could be pulled to accelerate drainage after a flood. In areas where floods were frequent and memory was long, these adaptations became local practice. A traveler passing through river towns in the 1890s might notice that many cabins near the water had doors framed differently than those on higher ground. Thresholds looked thicker, more deliberately constructed. Doorways had stone sills or raised platforms. The differences were subtle but consistent. In regions where the 1881 flood remained a singular event, catastrophic but not repeated, the motivation to modify construction was weaker. Settlers rebuilt on higher ground if they rebuilt at all. Cabins that survived were left as they were. The extra labor and materials required to engineer a threshold for drainage seemed excessive when weighed against the perceived low probability of another such flood. Some adaptations failed or created new problems. Scuppers cut without regard for foundation stability could undermine sills or cause erosion under stone piers. Thresholds made from softwoods like pine swelled when wet, jamming in their housings and becoming impossible to remove. Drains that were not screened or protected from debris clogged with silt and straw, defeating their purpose. An early attempt at a removable threshold might use simple notches rather than proper housings and pins. Without lateral support, the sill shifted under foot traffic, creating gaps that admitted drafts and vermin. After a season of use, the builder might conclude the design was flawed and revert to a fixed threshold, not recognizing that the problem was execution rather than concept. Town histories for river communities show a mix of responses after 1881. Vermilion, which lost much of its original riverside site, relocated to higher bluffs a mile inland. The new town site was platted well above any recorded flood level. Green Island, a steamboat landing on the Missouri, was largely abandoned after the flood destroyed most structures. Other settlements, smaller farm clusters, isolated homesteads, adapted in place. Some elevated their cabins on taller piers or stone foundations. Others built secondary levees or drainage ditches around their buildings. A few engineered their thresholds. The lift-out sill and related techniques remained niche solutions applied in specific contexts by builders who understood both the principle and the need. For every cabin that incorporated controlled drainage, dozens were built without it. The absence of the feature was not necessarily a failure of knowledge transfer. It often reflected rational calculation. If the site was high enough to avoid all but the most extreme floods, or if relocation was feasible, engineering a drainage threshold was unnecessary. If labor and materials were scarce, simpler solutions took priority. But in the record of cabins that survived repeated floods over decades, structures that remained sound and inhabited long after their neighbors had rotted or been abandoned, there is a pattern. Controlled drainage, whether through lift-out sills, raised thresholds with removable boards, or other deliberate water management features, appears more frequently than in the general population of flood-exposed buildings. The method spread where floods were frequent, memory was long, and local craftspeople could execute the joinery. It remained rare where risk was discounted, where relocation was chosen over adaptation, or where labor costs were judged too high. The historical record shows far more relocated towns than engineered thresholds, a testament as much to human risk tolerance and economic calculation as to the technical merits of the sill design itself. Present-day analysis with 19th century examples. Split-screen visual, historic log cabin floor detail on one side, modern shop door with removable aluminum floodboards on the other. Many modern rural shops, cabins, and outbuildings still sit in low ground or near creeks for practical reasons: access to water, proximity to resources, flat land that is otherwise unsuitable for crops. This pattern repeats 19th century siting choices. The lessons from frontier flood management remain relevant. Elevation is the first principle. After the 1881 flood, towns like Vermilion moved to higher terraces, accepting the inconvenience of distance from the river in exchange for safety from future floods. Modern builders face similar trade-offs. Placing a structure above the documented high water mark eliminates most flood risk, but may require longer utility runs, more difficult access, or more expensive site preparation. When elevation is not fully feasible, when the structure must sit in a flood-prone zone due to function, cost, or site constraints, the next principle is controlled drainage. This is where the lift-out sill translates directly to contemporary practice. Foundation ventilation is critical. Log building restoration manuals emphasize providing airflow under floors to reduce moisture accumulation. Crawl spaces should have vents on opposite walls to allow cross-ventilation. Modern building codes for flood-prone areas often require elevated foundations with open lattice or vented walls to allow water to pass under the structure rather than pooling against it. These requirements echo the same principle. Water that cannot accumulate cannot cause prolonged damage. Sacrificial and demountable parts shift risk from catastrophic to manageable. In modern flood protection systems, demountable barriers, often aluminum or steel boards that drop into fixed channels beside doorways, are standard in commercial and industrial settings. These systems descend directly from the mill stop log, removable elements that can be installed when flooding threatens and removed afterward, protecting the opening during the event while allowing normal use the rest of the time. For residential and small-scale applications, the lift-out sill concept scales well. A threshold treated as a replaceable element, set on pins or in shallow housings, can be removed when floodwater threatens. A graded threshold with a built-in drainage channel directs water away from the building even when the door is closed. Drainable floor bays with removable access panels over drainage sumps allow water that does enter to be expelled quickly. Preservation briefs on moisture control in historic buildings stress the importance of redirecting water away from building envelopes and providing controlled drainage paths. Gutters and downspouts move roof runoff to discharge points away from foundations. Grading around buildings slopes away to prevent pooling. French drains and perimeter drains collect groundwater and direct it to safe outlets. All these techniques recognize that water will be present and plan for where it will go. The Frontier lift-out sill applied this logic to an opening, the doorway, where water was most likely to enter during a flood. Modern floodproofing applies the same logic to entire structures. Basements in flood zones are designed with floor drains and sump pumps. Lower walls are built with water-resistant materials or designed to allow water to pass through, rather than accumulating pressure against the wall. Electrical and mechanical systems are elevated above expected flood heights. The technical checklist for flood-conscious building, informed by frontier practice and modern engineering, includes elevation. Site the structure as high above known high water marks as practical. If full elevation is not feasible, raise the lowest occupied floor above grade. Foundation design. Use piers, posts, or open foundations that allow water to pass underneath. Ensure adequate ventilation in any enclosed crawl space. Threshold and door design. Treat thresholds as demountable elements. Use pins, slots, or removable fasteners to allow rapid threshold removal if flooding threatens. Ensure the door itself can be opened or removed to prevent pressure buildup. Drainage paths. Cut scupper channels or install floor drains at low points. Grade floors slightly toward these drains so water flows naturally rather than pooling. Materials. Use rot-resistant woods, treated timbers, or synthetic materials for lower structural members. Avoid materials that degrade rapidly when wet. Ventilation. Provide cross-ventilation in all enclosed spaces below the living level. Install vents that can be opened after flooding to accelerate drying. Maintenance. Inspect and maintain drainage paths, ensuring they are clear of debris. Check that removable elements like thresholds or barrier boards remain operable. These principles are not revolutionary. They are extensions of practices developed on the frontier and refined through generations of building in flood-prone areas. The lift-out sill is less a single clever trick and more a mindset. Assume the water will come and decide ahead of time where it will go. Missouri-James Region and Frontier Settlement Patterns, 1881 and after. Surveyor's sketch overlaying old and new town sites at Vermilion, showing the move from low floodplain to higher terrace. The Great Flood of 1881 erased entire communities from the landscape. Green Island, a once thriving steamboat landing on the Missouri, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Vermilion lost as much as 60% of its original town site to the flood, with water reaching window height in riverside buildings. The survivors relocated to bluffs a mile inland, abandoning the low ground to agriculture and occasional high water. These relocations represented economic calculations. Rebuilding in the same location meant accepting the risk of future floods. Moving to higher ground meant investing in new roads, wells, and infrastructure, but eliminated the flood threat. For towns with sufficient resources and available land, relocation made sense. The cost was borne once. The benefit lasted indefinitely. For individual homesteaders and small settlements, the calculation was different. Relocating a cabin meant abandoning an established claim, losing improvements made to the original site, and starting over. Many could not afford that. They rebuilt in place, often on the same foundations, and hoped the next flood would be less severe. Settlement patterns across the central Missouri Valley show both responses. River towns that depended on steamboat commerce and had access to nearby high ground moved after 1881. Isolated farms and small clusters tied to specific parcels of land by homestead law and investment stayed. Over the following decades, repeated floods gradually sorted the landscape. Bottom farms that could survive flooding with manageable repairs accumulated value and history. Those that rotted or washed away appeared only as property descriptions in land records and as ruined foundations in later surveys. Hydrologic summaries compiled in the 20th century still use 1881 as a benchmark flood year in the James and Missouri basins. Stage heights from that event appear in flood frequency analyses. Engineers designing levees, dams, and floodplain management systems reference the 1881 flood as an example of an extreme but plausible event. The flood became a reference point not just for survivors who remembered it, but for subsequent generations planning how to live safely in the same valleys. The lift-out sill and similar adaptive strategies fit into this larger pattern. They were not solutions for everyone, nor were they necessary in all locations. But for cabins that had to remain in flood-prone areas because the claim was there, because the investment had already been made, because the risk was accepted, a threshold that could be removed represented a way to manage that risk without abandoning the site. The broader lesson was about trade-offs. Cheap land in the bottoms carried hidden long-term costs. Structures built quickly without regard for drainage might last a few years or a few decades, but eventually failed. Relocation was expensive up front, but eliminated recurring damage. Engineering solutions like lift-out sills required more initial labor and thought, but reduced long-term maintenance and damage. Ledger lines tell the story in numbers. A cabin built in 1880 at a total cost of perhaps $100 to $150 in materials and labor, assuming some purchased hardware, nails, and milled lumber alongside on-site timber, could be expected to serve 10 to 20 years under normal conditions. If it flooded severely once or twice during that period and was not equipped with drainage, repairs might cost another $50 to $100 in materials and many days of labor. If it flooded and drained quickly, repairs might be minimal. Cleaning, minor plank replacement, rechinking, costing perhaps $10 to $20 and a few days. The extra day of work to build a lift-out sill, cutting housings, boring holes, fitting pins, routing a scupper channel, might add $5 to $10 in labor cost at initial construction. Against the potential savings of avoiding one or more major floor rebuilds over the structure's life, the investment was rational, but only if the flood came. For cabins that never experienced severe flooding, the lift-out sill was wasted effort. The builder could have spent that day on other tasks. This uncertainty, investing in protection against an event that might never occur, explains why the technique remained uncommon. Most people, given the choice, bet that the worst would not happen to them. Statistically, most won that bet. A few lost catastrophically. The final accounting from the 1881 flood appears in census records, property rolls, and local histories. Dozens of farms were abandoned in the James and Missouri bottomlands. Some families moved to higher ground within the territory. Others left Dakota entirely, returning east or heading farther west. The population boom that had been filling the region slowed for several years as word of the flood spread. But the territory continued to grow. By 1889, Dakota was admitted to the Union as two states, North and South Dakota. The settlers who stayed, who rebuilt with improved techniques, who learned from the flood, became the foundation of stable communities. They built better, not always with lift-out sills, but with drainage in mind, with foundations set higher, with structures designed to withstand not just average conditions, but extreme events. In a river system where snowmelt could raise stages by 20 feet in a season and drown 6 to 15 feet of bottomland, the cabins that lasted were not the ones that kept water out at all costs. They were the ones that gave it a fast way through, then dried in time for the next winter. If you value fact-grounded frontier history and practical engineering lessons from real events, consider supporting the channel so we can keep digging into the build logs, flood records, and field manuals behind these stories.